Howdy y'all, welcome back, thank you for being here. One of the most thought-provoking aspects of United States history is the attention to detail that was implemented from the very inception of the country. The overwhelmingly strong focus we see on seemingly impossible numbers lends itself to the idea that, at least in part, there was meticulous effort put forth to document, or possibly fabricate, the birth of a nation. Today, using simple numbers that have been presented as fact by the United States, we will attempt to point out some statistical anomalies within the early history of America. As always, as this is the mainstream narrative, take it all with a grain of salt, but it is through these numbers and the symbolism that I believe we can begin to unravel the threads that bind this history. Our story begins with American independence being officially adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th of 1776. One of the first orders of business, after about a decade and a half of settling or inheriting their new country, was for the United States government to conduct the first official census in August of 1790. The census was actually an original order and facet of the Constitution within Article 1, Section 2. Who was behind this particular aspect of American history? None other than founding father and active Secretary of State at that time, Thomas Jefferson. After his noble deeds compiling the information that would become the earliest history of America, Jefferson was then named the third president of the country in 1801. But I digress. So, this 1790 census will be the topic I'd like to focus on today. It was an original aspect of the Constitution, which sort of allows us to see inside the minds of the founding fathers. And in my opinion, it points to a concerted effort being put forth to create an American history through possible nefarious means. We're told Secretary of State Jefferson charged the federal Marshals of America with conducting this entire census. And while the Marshals are often imagined as the strongest of early enforcers of American law, the narrative indicates the Marshals very much acted as surveyors and patrolmen of the borders. For example, the United States Federal Marshals were in charge of the American census, all of them, taken from 1790 through 1840, and it is through the census that the U.S. Marshals became household names and well-known domestically. Furthermore, by order of the Constitution, the census required the Marshals to visit every known house in the United States of America. Every single one. When completed, the census covered over 56 pages of material and cost the taxpayers an estimated $44,500, or roughly $1.5 million when adjusted for inflation, which seems like a measly sum when you imagine that the Marshals are said to have visited every home, from mountaintop retreats in Appalachia, obscure and remote communities in the wilderness throughout the South, and former indigenous settlements. The Marshals are said to have seen every inch of the settled America. But the question becomes, do we believe it? What's furthermore, and this is the real doozy to me, but if you dive into this, Secretary Jefferson and President George Washington both were said to have concluded that the results of the first census were skewed, and they believed that America had far more people than the census gave it credit for, both free men and also countless more slaves, which were said to be unaccounted for. The end result of the first census, this 1790 census, saw a total of 3,929,214 people living in America, but what's most revealing is that 697,697 of them were considered to be enslaved. The symbolism of that repeating number aside, that is nearly 18% of the population at that time, the highest proportion of slaves to free men in any American census. Add to that the American Secretary of State Jefferson and the President Washington both privately exclaimed that this census vastly underrepresented the enslaved population, and we can only begin to imagine what the true population numbers really were. As I've stated in previous videos, there's beginning to be more evidence that's coming to the surface coinciding with new theories which point to much of the early enslaved population possibly being of indigenous heritage, possibly sold into servitude by their chiefs through the numerous treaties of before the year 1800. Through a manipulation of that history, and possibly of the timeline, at least in this theory, the true nature of indigenous populations in America was compartmentalized, and in many ways, it was watered down or erased entirely. It appears this was to paint the picture that evil men purchased the enslaved labor from overseas, then brought it to America and used that to build the country. And for this cruelty, a civil war began, and these facets of evil were erased. In that narrative, the mainstream one, everything is cut and dry. It's black and white, with clear pictures of good and evil being painted, both of which were seemingly erased through the Civil War, meant to leave no questions to be asked. However, how much more complicated would American history truly be if the country was built by those who resided here originally? Then the grand ushering of indigenous people to new land reveals a sudden truth, as do the vast systems of re-education schools that were founded throughout the Americas in the 17 and 1800s, not filled with necessarily who we might imagine, but rather most of these schools became indigenous re-education schools. And we know of the inhumane conditions that were often popping up at these locations. We've discussed before the orphan trains sent to populate these new cities, but really, the orphan trains could have represented the new line, the acceptable new version of indentured servitude. We have displaced children, but often they had indigenous ancestry sent throughout the country on trains to be, quote, adopted, but that meant they were working in factories and with families who were running farms and other things like that. And through this process, it appears the indigenous history, whatever the true history may have been, was quite literally watered down. I've seen tens of thousands of hours of evidence that this was the case. And if you want some to look at directly, we can focus on the thousands of burial mounds that were said to be excavated in America directly before the advent of photography. We have the residue of a vastly superior culture of some kind, which either assimilated with or was decimated by the Europeans. The question becomes, which one of those options makes more sense? According to the 1790 census, which collected the data of every single person in Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, the District of Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia, and the Southwest Territory, which at that time included most of present-day northern Tennessee. I'll get to the findings of the census in a moment, but also striking within the narrative is that Vermont did not take part in the initial census. While part of the fight against British power, Vermont declared its own independence in January of 1777, and it was then known as the Republic of New Connecticut, which apparently was created by some rich merchants from Connecticut who wanted to rule over the Connecticut landscape from an independent kingdom. Why I had never heard about this before is beyond me. But by June of 1777, facing backlash from the United States, the Republic of New Connecticut changed its name to Vermont. And later that year, on July 4th, the leaders and merchants of Vermont drafted the Constitution of Vermont inside their Masonic stronghold known as the Windsor Tavern. By 1791, 1 year after the census was taken, Vermont was officially a member of the United States and had its first census taken that year. Vermont, in 1791, had roughly 85,000 people said to be living there, with only 16 being enslaved. Now back to the 1790 survey, the real meat and potatoes. Interesting here, and if it's different, I will state otherwise, but the survey divides people into two different age groups, either 16 and older or under the age of 16. What's remarkable is, for every state, the numbers are just about even for those who are over the age of 16 as compared to those who are under. To me, this seems to indicate a rapid influx of children appearing in America, quite literally directly after America's inception. For roughly half of the population to be under the age of 16 in 1790, just 14 years after the Declaration of Independence, and among the ongoing conflicts, is truly a revealing detail. Now here are the numbers of the 1790 census that really stand out. And I'll leave the full chart for the census with all of the numbers in the video right here. The most occupied state at this time was Virginia, by far. The same location that truly has an esoteric history, tying back to what appears to be a lost group, or a few different lost groups of great power that were seemingly being written out of the history at this time. Virginia had roughly 750,000 people in 1790. This beat out the next most populated state, which was Pennsylvania, by over 300,000 people. What's incredible is that over 290,000 of Virginia's nearly 750,000 people are recorded as being enslaved, which equates to roughly 39% of the population. Nearly 2/5. However, the worst state for that ratio is actually South Carolina. Of the less than 250,000 people that were recorded as living in the state in 1790, over 107,000 of them were enslaved, making up 43% of the population. If we consider the vast tracts of lands, the settlements, as well as the inventions and the technology that we know was inherited from the indigenous people of America. And then we consider the remarks of Jefferson and Washington and other founding fathers who believed that the first census vastly underreported the enslaved people. Then we consider the fact that every census after 1790 saw a drastic dip in the percentage of enslaved people reported. Then we can begin to see how it's almost impossible that the numbers that have been reported in the first census of America can be trusted. Through the anomalies of the first census, I believe we can begin to see credence in the idea that American history may have been manufactured by the alleged victors, founding fathers, who first had to gain an intimate knowledge of the landscape secrets to know how to counteract the history. To achieve this, one of the first activities, what some may see as a nefarious act, could have been the census of 1790, which saw every single community in America supposedly infiltrated by brand new American forces.